Hi everyone. The story I'm about to tell you is one wrapped in secrets, pride, betrayal, and the kind of quiet power only a true queen carries deep within her bones. A story about a woman who walked into a family that believed she should bow, not knowing she was already born crowned. Before we step into her world, before we peel back the layers of insult, deception, and destiny, make sure you like, subscribe, and stay locked in. Because what you're about to hear belongs to the kingdom we call Black Queen Dominion. This story begins long before her husband ever told her she should be grateful he chose her. Long before his mother's knees buckled. Long before the truth that would change everything rose to the surface like a storm. It starts on a quiet morning when she stood at the gates of the family estate for the first time, suitcase in hand, heart steady, and soul anchored in the kind of strength only life's hardest lessons can build. Her name was Amara, though the family rarely used it. They preferred terms that pressed her down gently, the way a hand pushes dust from a surface. Subtle but meant to remind her she didn't belong. From the very first day she stepped into that grand home, she felt the coldness of eyes that believed they held dominion over who she was allowed to be. The estate stood sprawling and proud, its white stone gleaming beneath the sun like polished bone. It was old money, inherited power, and the arrogance that comes with both. But none of them knew the truth wrapped quietly inside the woman they saw as ordinary. Amara had married into them out of love. Pure, unguarded, hopeful love. She believed her husband saw her heart. She believed his vows meant something. She believed his family would eventually see her worth. Hope is a tender thing, but sometimes the world handles it like thorns pressing into silk. From the moment she entered the main hall, she felt the weight of expectations shift onto her shoulders. His mother watched her with an expression carved from disdain. His sisters whispered behind manicured hands. His grandmother, old and sharp-eyed, regarded her like she was examining a blemish on a family portrait. Amara moved with grace despite it. She unpacked her things, she smiled softly at their stiffness, she swallowed hurt where pride might have risen. She believed kindness could melt that ice. She believed humility was strength. But the truth was simpler. They mistook her gentleness for weakness. Her husband, Darius, was the pivot point between her and the fortress that was his family. He shifted depending on who was watching. In private he offered her affection, calm words, and promises. In front of them he shrank her, making her smaller so he could appear bigger. And with each passing month, the family learned to treat her as he presented her. An afterthought, a charity, someone who should be grateful simply to stand among them. The estate wasn't just a home. It was a hierarchy. Every room had rules. Every meal had invisible lines drawn between who served and who was served. Amara was never asked to serve, but her presence was treated as though she owed repayment for simply existing in their space. She was placed at the edge of conversations, included only when silence became too awkward. She ate last sometimes, not by instruction but by implication. Their world spun around lineage, status, name, and they believed she had none. But Amara was a woman raised on truth, not appearances. She knew where she came from. She knew what blood pulsed through her veins. She knew the legacy her grandmother whispered into her ear when she was a child. The same grandmother the world never knew was one of the wealthiest women in the Southern Hemisphere. A matriarch who built her empire quietly, secretly, intentionally. A woman who taught Amara that true power doesn't roar, it waits. Amara had never spoken of her inheritance. Not because she was ashamed, but because she had promised her grandmother she would never reveal it until the moment she truly needed to. And she had not yet needed it. She believed love alone could hold her life upright. She believed she would never have to show them who she really was. But life has a way of peeling back the truth when the world becomes too small to hold its secrets. As time passed, the insults grew bolder. His mother, Eleanor, took every opportunity to remind Amara that she should be grateful. Grateful that Darius chose her. Grateful that they accepted her. Grateful that she was allowed into rooms that women like her never belonged in. Grateful for crumbs of respect she was never actually given. Amara endured it with a quiet strength that made Eleanor even more resentful. A woman like Eleanor thrived on domination, on seeing others bend. But Amara didn't bend. She absorbed. She waited. She watched. Queens do not rush their ascension. They rise when the moment calls. The moment arrived with the death of her grandmother. The call came early in the morning. Amara received the news with a crushing stillness that settled deep inside her. Her grandmother was not just a guardian. She was the keeper of the legacy Amara had protected in silence for years. Her passing meant the world would turn, and the secrets that had slept for generations would begin to stir. Darius offered her a shallow comfort, distracted and unmoved. His family offered her nothing at all. They expected her to grieve quietly, to return to her duties, to keep her head bowed. They didn't know that her grandmother's death came with a reading of a will that would shift everything. They didn't know the empire that woman controlled. They didn't know that Amara was the sole heir. And they didn't know that the estate they lived on, the land beneath their manicured gardens, their gold-plated halls, their towering trees, had history intertwined with the very empire they had always believed themselves superior to. The day of the funeral changed everything. Amara dressed in black silk, her posture regal, her eyes steady despite the heaviness in her spirit. She walked into the ceremony not as a wife, not as a daughter-in-law, not as the woman they diminished, but as a granddaughter honoring a queen who raised her. Members of her grandmother's circle attended in droves. Influential figures. Powerful families. People whose names made the quiet privilege tremble. And Darius's family? They didn't recognize a single one of them. They stood awkwardly, suddenly small in a room where they were used to towering. When the will was read, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Darius's family leaned in, curious but unaware of the tidal wave forming. And then the attorney's voice announced the truth. Amara was the inheritor of the entire empire. Every property, every estate, every investment, every ounce of power her grandmother held now belonged to her. Whispers surged like electricity. But the shock had only just begun. Because the attorney continued, revealing that part of that empire included land titles. Titles tied to estates, plural. Estates her grandmother had bought quietly under shell corporations. Estates located across several regions, including one that made Eleanor's face drain of color. Because one of those estates was the land their own family mansion stood on. And that was the moment the room tilted. That was the moment Eleanor's knees buckled. That was the moment the queen they tried to insult stood revealed. The moment Eleanor collapsed at the funeral reception, the room froze in a strange, suspended silence. It was the kind of silence that forms when reality shifts so violently that even the air struggles to keep up. Amara did not move toward her. Not out of cruelty but out of a knowing awareness. Some collapses are not physical. Some are the body surrendering beneath the weight of a truth too large to contain. As attendants rushed to Eleanor's side and lifted her into a chair, eyes darted between Amara and the attorney as though waiting for someone to declare that it was all a misunderstanding. But nothing changed. The papers remained stamped, the signatures remained valid, the inheritance remained hers. The authority that Amara had carried quietly for years now stood in the open, undeniable and absolute. Darius watched her with an expression she had never seen before, one mixed with confusion, disbelief and something darker brewing beneath. His pride trembled, unsettled by the revelation that the woman he had spoken down to, minimized, and shaped into a smaller version of herself was the same woman who now held the ground he walked on. His family's whispers echoed like distant waves crashing against a cliffside, too soft to decipher but heavy enough to feel the judgment in every syllable. When the ceremony ended and guests moved through the reception hall in hushed constellations of shock, Amara stepped away for a moment of solitude. She found a quiet corner beside an arched window, the sky outside painted in shades of fading gold. Her grandmother always said that sunsets were reminders. Endings wrapped in beauty, warnings wrapped in warmth. On that evening the sky seemed to whisper exactly that. But while the world around her shifted, Amara remained still. Her grief was real, heavy, aching, and yet even in sorrow she carried herself with a calm that unnerved those who had underestimated her. The truth was simple. She did not feel triumphant. Not yet. She did not feel victorious over the family that had tried to make her small. She simply felt the weight of the crown that had always been hers finally settling into place. By the time evening shadows stretched across the reception hall, the tension had transformed into an unspoken unease. Darius's family gathered discreetly in corners, glancing at her with new eyes, eyes that no longer saw someone beneath them, but someone they had accidentally provoked into power. Each of them processed the truth at different speeds. His sisters appeared unsettled, whispering furiously. His grandmother displayed a frozen dignity, fighting the tremor tightening her jaw. Eleanor, pale and trembling, avoided looking directly at Amara as though eye contact itself might reawaken the shock. Only one question circled them all. How long had she known? The ride back to the estate felt colder than any winter storm. The air was thick with tension, the kind that clung to skin like frost. When the gates of the mansion swung open, Amara stepped out with an awareness that the place she was entering was no longer the same. The walls looked different. The corridors felt altered. The energy pulsed with the sudden shift in power. This was still their home, but it was also her land. As she walked through the halls that had once echoed with subtle humiliation, the memory of each moment pressed faintly against her mind. The day they made her sit at the farthest end of the table during a family dinner. The time they spoke of charity events while glancing at her as if she should understand her place. The morning Eleanor casually suggested she should help the staff to learn humility. Each memory resurfaced not to hurt her, but to remind her how carefully she had carried herself through storms they never knew she weathered. That night, as the house settled into uneasy quiet, Amara stood alone in the bedroom she shared with Darius. The moonlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting silver across the room like liquid truth. She sat on the edge of the bed and let the night press into her. For the first time since the funeral, she allowed herself to breathe fully, deeply, without restraint. She thought of her grandmother, of the lessons, of the whispered affirmations, of the stories of the empire she would one day inherit. She remembered how her grandmother used to rest her hands on Amara's shoulders and tell her she carried a lineage built by queens who never needed to announce themselves. Power, her grandmother often said, is not in being seen, but in being known. And now the world knew. By morning the house was buzzing with nervous energy. Eleanor avoided Amara entirely, choosing instead to remain in her room with the curtains drawn. Darius's sisters moved with forced politeness, curiosity simmering beneath the surface. His grandmother watched Amara with a calculating calm that revealed nothing but hinted at everything. But the strangest shift came from Darius himself. Where he had once spoken down to her, he now walked carefully around her. Where he once expected her to follow, he now hesitated to step ahead. Where he once reveled in control, he now sensed a loss he didn't yet know how to articulate. It wasn't that he feared her power, yet. It was that he feared how much of his own identity relied on believing she had none. For days the mansion operated like a house holding its breath. Conversation shrank. Apologies hovered unspoken. Pride warred with panic. And through it all Amara remained silent. Not to punish them, but because silence often reveals more truth than words ever can. She moved through the house with the same quiet grace she always had, but now every eye followed her. Every step reminded them that the ground beneath their feet had shifted. Every moment forced them to acknowledge the one thing they had never imagined. The woman they dismissed was now the most powerful person in their orbit. Still, Amara was patient. She did not flaunt her inheritance. She did not rush to change the dynamics of the household. She simply observed, waited, allowed them to sit with the discomfort of their own assumptions unraveling. Until one morning, a thick envelope arrived at the mansion, addressed to her. Inside was the full portfolio of her grandmother's estate, meticulously detailed. And among the documents lay something unexpected. A letter penned in her grandmother's graceful handwriting. A letter that revealed a deeper connection, a revelation woven into the fabric of their shared past. A truth her grandmother had kept hidden until the exact moment Amara would need it most. The letter detailed not just ownership of the land, but the history of how her grandmother acquired it, why she chose that region, and the silent ties between Amara's lineage and the very foundation of Darius's family legacy. It was not coincidence. It was legacy. It was strategy. It was fate. And as Amara read the final line, her breath caught. Because the letter revealed that the connection between her family and the mansion's land was older, deeper, and more intentional than anyone in the household could imagine. The inheritance was not a coincidence. It was a reclamation. And when Amara lifted her eyes, a new chapter of power stirred within her. The morning Amara received her grandmother's letter, the house was unusually still. A strange hush blanketed the mansion as if the walls themselves sensed what the envelope carried. The handwriting on its front felt like a final touch from the woman who had shaped her destiny long before she understood what destiny truly meant. As Amara unfolded the letter and let her eyes drift across the inked lines, the world around her seemed to slow, pausing to allow history to speak. her grandmother revealed a truth woven with quiet brilliance. A truth that reframed everything Amara believed she understood about her inheritance. The land on which Darius's family estate stood had once belonged to Amara's ancestors. Not by chance. Not through luck. Through deliberate legacy. Her grandmother had repurchased that land decades ago, long before Amara was born, and placed it under a trust so deep in secrecy that even government officials treated it like a ghost property. It was land that had been taken from their family generations earlier, during a time when wealth was buried beneath oppression, when power was stripped through contracts forged in desperation and signed in coercion. Her grandmother spent her life reclaiming what had been lost. Piece by piece. Acre by acre. Brick by brick. She rebuilt a lineage that had been forced into silence, not through rage but through strategy. And now with her passing, that legacy rested in Amara's hands. Her inheritance was not just wealth. It was restoration. The letter explained that the mansion where Amara had been mistreated, belittled, and overlooked stood on land meant to return to its rightful bloodline. The former owners, Darius's ancestors, had acquired it through exploitation decades earlier. Amara's grandmother did not reveal this history while alive. She believed that some truths should be delivered at the exact moment they would serve their greatest purpose. And the exact moment was now. As Amara read the final sentences, her breath slowed. The words did not stir vengeance, they stirred clarity. They stitched together every fragment of her story into a tapestry far larger than her pain. She understood with startling certainty. She had not married into that family by accident. Fate had placed her at the heart of her family's reclaimed legacy, even when she believed she had simply followed her heart. When she lowered the letter, the mansion felt different. Not as a cage, not as a fortress, but as territory she was born to walk. Yet downstairs, Darius's family remained unaware of this deeper history. They believed the inheritance was merely money, property, power. They had no idea it was reclamation. 4 days after the funeral, tension continued to weave silently through the household. Eleanor avoided the common areas, consumed by the shock that her scorned daughter-in-law now held ownership papers that overshadowed her family's legacy. Darius walked in circles around his own pride, unsure how to approach a woman whose worth he had underestimated so profoundly. His sisters watched Amara with a mix of fascination and fear, and his grandmother's quiet study grew sharper, more calculating, as though she felt something stirring beneath the surface. But Amara said nothing. She held her silence like armor, letting the weight of the truth move through her on its own time. She lived as she always had, graciously, gently, with a calm the household could no longer interpret. Was she plotting revenge? Did she intend to evict them? Would she sell the property? No one knew. And the uncertainty gnawed at them. One evening, as the sky darkened into streaks of violet and blue, Amara stepped outside to the mansion's back garden. It had once been Eleanor's pride, rows of perfectly trimmed hedges, marble fountains whispering streams of water, stone pathways arranged with precision. Amara walked slowly along those paths, letting her fingertips brush the leaves her ancestors once walked among generations before history forced them away. Now she had returned to it, not through war but through wisdom. The wind carried the faint scent of blooming gardenia, her grandmother's favorite flower. Amara paused, closing her eyes, letting the evening settle into her. She felt the weight of every expectation that had ever been placed upon her by this household, and the weight of every generation that had fought quietly so she might stand here. The power she held was not meant to crush, it was meant to correct. In the days that followed, small changes began to ripple through the mansion. Not because Amara imposed them but because the family's fear reshaped their behavior. The staff treated her differently, no longer with pity, but with respect that grew each time they witnessed the subtle shifts in the family's demeanor. Darius's voice softened when speaking to her, carefully measured, almost rehearsed. His sisters went out of their way to appear helpful, though their eyes betrayed unease. Eleanor remained in retreat, emerging only when necessary, moving through the halls like a ghost trapped in a home no longer hers. But the greatest shift came from the grandmother of the family. The matriarch, old and sharp-eyed, began watching Amara with an intensity that penetrated the calm she outwardly maintained. The elder woman sensed something deeper than wealth, deeper than inheritance. She sensed history. She sensed reclamation. And Amara sensed that the older woman would soon approach her. But before that confrontation could happen, another unexpected element entered the story. A legal notification arrived one morning. A formal summons requesting Amara's presence in a private meeting with the board that managed part of her grandmother's corporate empire. The letter explained that her inheritance was larger than previously disclosed. There were properties not yet revealed publicly, investments tied to international ventures, and expansions that positioned Amara not just as wealthy, but as one of the most influential landowners in the region. This meeting would finalize her full control. But more importantly, it would reveal that her grandmother had left one final hidden asset, an asset directly connected to Darius's family legacy. Something that would not just unsettle the household, but destabilize it. In the quiet of her room that night, Amara sat again with her grandmother's letter. She traced the final line over and over, the ink slightly smudged from the generations of meaning it carried. Her grandmother wrote that the estate was only the beginning. There was one more truth. One more connection. One more piece of history waiting to surface. One that would finally expose the full extent of her family's rise, and the other family's fall. Amara understood that confronting this final truth would ignite the storm fully. And she was ready. She had walked humbly. She had endured quietly. She had risen silently. But soon the world, especially the household that tried to diminish her, would learn the full power of the queen they underestimated. Because queens do not merely inherit. They ascend. And Amara's ascension was only just beginning. The night before Amara's meeting with the board, the mansion felt like a vessel drifting between storms. Every corner of the house pulsed with quiet dread, as though the walls sensed that the tide was about to turn in a way no one could prevent. Amara felt the shift as well, not as fear but as a steady pull of destiny drawing her toward the truth her grandmother left behind. The morning arrived soft and gray. Mist clung to the garden as she stepped outside, breathing in the cool air that brushed her skin like a reminder of everything she had endured. She carried herself with the same poise she had always possessed, but something deeper moved beneath her calm surface. An awakening, a readiness, a silent flame. A car brought her into the city, through bustling streets that existed far beyond the world of Darius's family and their illusions of superiority. As she arrived at the corporate building her grandmother once ruled, she felt the echo of generations walking beside her. The lobby, sleek and towering with mirrored walls and polished floors, reflected a version of herself she had only begun to understand. A woman born into legacy, molded by humility, strengthened through adversity. When she reached the meeting floor, every executive in the room rose. The respect was immediate, instinctive, absolute. Not because of her last name but because of the empire her grandmother built. An empire now entrusted to her. The board presented her with documents detailing the full extent of her inheritance. Page after page revealed properties, business holdings, and investment networks so vast they stretched across continents. But one folder, sealed with a crimson ribbon, held the truth she had been preparing herself for, the final connection her grandmother had hinted at. When the ribbon fell away and the folder opened, the air in the room shifted. Inside were historical records, old maps, legal contracts, and letters exchanged generations ago between Amara's ancestors and Darius's. Each document illuminated the truth. Decades earlier, long before either family became what they were now, a land dispute had unfolded in secrecy. Her family had been forced into a corner through manipulation and deceit, losing the land that later became the foundation of Darius's family legacy. Her grandmother spent half her life quietly hunting down every record, collecting proof, purchasing back parcels of land linked to the original betrayal, ensuring that by the time Amara was grown, the wrong that had scattered their lineage would be restored. But the board revealed something more, a detail even Amara hadn't anticipated. Her grandmother had acquired not just the land beneath Darius's estate. She had purchased the rights to several surrounding properties, businesses owned by Eleanor's relatives, and portions of the trust that sustained their generational wealth. Slowly, quietly, strategically, Amara's grandmother had reclaimed everything that family had ever used to elevate themselves, all under different subsidiaries, names, and trusts. Darius's family had been living, thriving, expanding on borrowed power. Power that now belonged to Amara. As she absorbed the truth, something inside her shifted, not into vengeance but into understanding. Her grandmother had not intended to destroy the other family. She had intended to balance the scales. to restore dignity, to ensure Amara would never live at the mercy of people who believed they were above her. When the meeting concluded, the board left her alone with the documents. She sat at the long table, the city lights glowing through the windows like constellations, and let the weight of history settle into her. Everything, every insult she endured, every dismissal, every subtle act meant to diminish her, suddenly felt small in comparison to the legacy she now carried. Not because she sought revenge, but because she finally understood her place in a story much older than her marriage. When she returned to the mansion that evening, the atmosphere felt tighter, almost suffocating. Her steps echoed through the halls as though the house itself waited for her next move. But she did not return to unleash anger. She returned to prepare. Later that night, a soft knock sounded outside her room. Amara knew who it was before the figure even appeared. The family matriarch, Darius's grandmother, entered slowly, leaning on her cane, her presence wrapped in age-old dignity. She stood for a moment studying Amara, her gaze steady, sharp, and unblinking. The old woman had sensed the shift long before the others. She felt history moving in Amara's wake, though she could not yet name it. She approached Amara with the quiet confidence of a woman who had seen too many truths to be rattled by this one. Her expression held no hatred, no fear, only recognition. A recognition that transcended wealth, status, or bloodline. A recognition born of knowing when one queen stands in the presence of another. Without a word, she placed a small velvet box on the table before leaving the room. Amara did not open it immediately. She waited, letting the gesture rest in the air like a fragile offering. When she finally lifted the lid, she found an antique brooch made of onyx and gold, an heirloom passed down through the matriarchal line of Darius's family for generations. By leaving it with Amara, the elder woman had acknowledged what no one else in the household could yet admit. The power had shifted and the rightful bearer of legacy stood before them. The next morning, tension in the house swelled like a storm tide. Eleanor emerged at breakfast, her face drained, her pride clinging to its last threads. Darius moved through the room with restless energy, unsure how to navigate a world where he no longer held the dominant role. His sisters stepped lightly, glancing at Amara with an uneasy reverence. The matriarch watched everything with silent acceptance. But Amara remained quiet. She had not come to brandish power. She had come to prepare for the final truth her grandmother left behind. The truth that would turn the household's unease into full reckoning. Because among the documents she received at the meeting was a sealed envelope. A final message from her grandmother. Inside it were the clues to the last piece of their intertwined history. Proof that would show not only how their families were connected, but why fate placed Amara in the exact position she now stood. A truth capable of ending an era. That night, as the moon rose high and white above the mansion's roof, Amara stood on the balcony overlooking the land that had been taken, reclaimed, and returned. She knew what she had to do next. She had walked the long path from humility to revelation. She had endured storms meant to break her. She had risen into the legacy designed for her. And now she would finally uncover the last truth hidden by time. Dawn rose quietly over the estate, casting pale gold light across the grounds as though unveiling the final act of a long unfolding truth. The mansion stood still beneath the morning sky, its windows glinting softly, unaware that before the day ended, the shadow of a buried history would rise and settle over every corner. Amara awoke with a clarity that steadied her heart. Today the last piece of her grandmother's legacy would be revealed. Today she would step fully into the power that had always followed her, waiting for its moment to be claimed. On her desk, the sealed envelope, her grandmother's final message, rested like an artifact of destiny. She opened it with careful hands, breathing in the faint trace of lavender that still clung to the paper, a scent her grandmother carried her entire life. Inside the envelope lay a set of coordinates, old photographs, and a final written message. The handwriting was steady, elegant, and achingly familiar. Her grandmother explained that there was one more property. One not listed in any portfolio, one kept off official records entirely. It had been acquired with meticulous secrecy to protect it from the lineage that once stole from their family. This property held archives older than the mansion itself. Letters, deeds, testimonies, and early documentation of how the land was taken and the lengths Darius's ancestors went to preserve their claim. But more importantly, it contained proof of something deeper. evidence that Amara's family and Darius's were connected by an old agreement broken long before she or he were born. Her ancestors had once forged a pact with his. A pact meant to ensure unity and shared prosperity. But betrayal fractured that bond. Darius's lineage broke the agreement, seizing land, erasing records, and rebuilding their legacy through the ashes of someone else's loss. Amara's grandmother refused to let that truth fade into history's shadows. She collected the remnants, protected them, and preserved them in the hidden property that now awaited Amara. The instructions were clear. She was to travel alone. She was to uncover the archives. And she was to decide how the truth would be handled, not from a place of rage, but from the fullness of understanding her grandmother believed she possessed. As she drove out of the estate, passing through towering trees lining the old road, the world seemed to shift. The deeper she traveled into the countryside, the more she felt the presence of the generations who walked before her. The hidden property was tucked away behind a veil of dense forest, its entrance marked by stone pillars carved with symbols from her ancestral line. When she arrived, the house stood small, weathered, and unassuming, nothing like the grand estate she lived in. Yet the moment Amara stepped across its threshold, she felt history breathing in the walls. The space smelled of old wood, parchment, and time itself. Dusty sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating shelves stacked with ancient boxes, journals bound by twine, and envelopes stamped with wax seals. She spent hours inside, carefully sifting through the documents her grandmother had collected. She found the original land deed belonging to her ancestors. She found letters exchanged between the two families, letters that revealed the initial unity between them before deception severed the bond. She uncovered testimonies from elders long gone, recounting how their land had been taken through manipulation. Every document told the same story. What Darius's family had always treated as their proud inheritance was built on a lie. But deeper in the archive, in a locked compartment beneath the floorboards, Amara discovered the final truth. Inside lay a single leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. The journal belonged to the earliest matriarch of her line, a woman of fierce resilience whose words carried the power of prophecy. The journal revealed that her ancestor had foreseen a return. She wrote that a woman born generations later would reclaim everything taken, not through force but through destiny. She described a marriage that would unite the two bloodlines again, not as a symbol of submission or victory, but as the bridge to restore the balance broken long ago. She described Amara. And she described the moment when truth would surface, forcing both families to face the consequences of their actions. It was not revenge that destiny held. It was restoration. Unity rebuilt not from dominance but from truth finally acknowledged. As Amara closed the journal, a calmness settled over her. Everything her grandmother had done, every secret she guarded, every piece of history she restored, it all led here. Amara was not simply the heir of wealth. She was the heir of correction. She carried a role meant to mend what was fractured long before any of them were born. When she returned to the estate later that evening, the tension in the house intensified the moment she stepped inside. The family sensed something had shifted, though none knew what. The matriarch watched her with the quiet understanding of someone who felt history's movement even without seeing it. Darius seemed restless, caught between confusion and the slow unraveling of the man he had been. Eleanor, though shaken, clung to the last remnants of her pride. But Amara no longer saw them as opponents. She saw them as descendants of the same story, two branches of a tree that had long been split at its trunk. In the days that followed, Amara began to make changes. Gentle ones. Subtle ones. She restored financial stability to the parts of the family business her grandmother had quietly acquired. She reorganized property rights so that everyone living on the land had secure futures. She ensured the estate staff received fair wages and benefits. And though she remained calm and silent, her actions reshaped the household more definitively than any confrontation ever could. Darius's family found their arrogance dissolving. Pride softened into humility. Tension eased into awareness. And slowly, though none dared say it aloud, they began to see Amara not as an outsider, not as a burden, not as someone beneath them, but as the woman holding together the very foundation beneath their feet. In time, the matriarch offered Amara quiet respect, acknowledging the strength she carried. Darius's sisters stepped cautiously into her presence, learning to observe rather than judge. Eleanor, humbled by the exposure of truth, retreated into reflection, grappling with the consequences of the lineage she once celebrated blindly. Darius struggled the most. His identity had been built on believing he held the superior place in their marriage. Watching that illusion crumble forced him to confront who he was without it. His path forward would take time, shaped not by dominance, but by the humility he had long resisted. And Amara? She rose fully into the legacy she inherited, not as a ruler, not as a conqueror, but as the queen her grandmother always knew she would become. The mansion, once a symbol of her suppression, became a symbol of reclamation. The land beneath it, stolen and restored across generations, now carried the footsteps of the woman destined to heal its history. Her journey was not one of revenge. It was one of revelation. Because the moment they learned who she truly was, they realized the woman they tried to silence was the owner of everything they stood on. And in the end, Amara understood the truth her grandmother carried her entire life. A queen does not rise to destroy. A queen rises to restore.